Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all at this citizen dialogue. Please start to take your seats so that we may begin as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Bueno, si les parece, ya que estamos...
Well, now that we're all seated, if I may, I'd like to explain the rules of procedure for today in this citizen dialogue with the European Commissioner for Climate Action and Energy, Mr. Miguel Ángel Arias Cañete, and the President of the Canary Islands government, Mr. Fernando Clavijo. So first let me explain how this dialogue works. Participation is crucial. It's absolutely essential that all of you here today will take part in our dialogue so that we can meet the target of this event. First of all, I'd like to present the platform through which you will be asked to reply to a number of questions that will be posed to you this morning. It's called slido.com. So please take out your mobile phones. Please access via Google or other search engines so that you may access this website, slido.com. You'll see the hashtag 2203. Please introduce that number, which, by the way, that's the day today, and that's the International Day for Water Resources. So hashtag 2203, I see you all doing it. That's great. And now you'll see the platform. We haven't posted any questions yet, so you won't see anything on the screen. We'll announce those questions throughout the dialogue. You'll see a brochure or some cards on your seats. That's another way in which you can pose your questions to our guests. So I'd like to encourage you to start writing down any questions you may have at this point while we wait for our guests to arrive. Questions on the European Union, challenges and priorities, the future of Europe. And as you can see, if you have any questions on any of those, then please write them down on the cards so that we can give them to our guests. Thank you very much.
Buenos días. Buenos días, presidente. Les pediría que tomen asiento. Ahora sí que los tenemos.
Please take your seats. I'd like to welcome our two guests, the European Commissioner for Action and Energy, Miguel Ángel Arias Cañete, and the President of the Canary Islands government, Fernando Clavijo. So while they get their microphones fitted, I'd like to present their CV to you. Miguel Ángel Arias Cañete is the European Commissioner for Climate Action and Energy. He's been in this position since the 1st of November 2014. He was born in 1950 in Madrid. He graduated at the Universidad Complutense in law. And after 1974, he joined government for some years. And after that, he was elected as European Commissioner in 1986. He continued there until 1999, presiding over committees for agriculture and regional development. He was also Minister for Agriculture and Fisheries in Spain until 2004 and Minister for Agriculture between 2011 and 2014 before he was again elected as an MEP. And I'd like to now present the President of the Canary Islands government, Mr. Fernando Clavijo Batlle, who was born here in La Laguna. He graduated in economics and business studies at the University of La Laguna. He worked in the private sector, and until he was appointed as the mayor of La Laguna, the youngest in history, in 2008. And he was also a local councillor for urban development. He launched a number of actions in the municipality of La Laguna, which were recognized in Spain. And then he was appointed as a candidate to the Canary Islands government presidency in 2015. And he hopes to be re-elected in the next elections because he will once again be the candidate for his party. So now that they have been duly presented, let's begin with the first questions that I'd like to announce. First question for this dialogue this morning. Do you believe that your voice is being heard and listened to in Europe? So please join our platform at slido.com, and you'll have 1 minute to first to introduce your answers to the first question.
Participantes, yo creo.
23 participants. There are more than 23 people in this room, so please enter your votes.
Les comento a las que no estaban cuando anunciaba, es la plataforma slide.com.
For those who weren't in the room, it's the platform is slide.com, which you have to enter in your mobile phones.
Bueno, yo creo que eso no se va a mover mucho más.
Well, I think most of our results are in. 33 participants, more or less. Well, we've got a few more in now. 2 more votes. Late voting. Same results as yesterday, says the President of the Canary Islands government.
Bueno, pues empezamos a comentar.
So let's begin to hear some remarks on the results. We're seeing variations here, 36 votes now. We're up to 50%. Do you think your voice is being heard in the European Union? More or less half believe yes, another half believe no. So what are your remarks on these results? Commissioner first. Well, we are seeing variations in the results. I think these results are very surprising, especially here in the Canary Islands. The European Commission has organized over 1,450 citizen dialogues with more than 160,000 citizens joining them, and these dialogues. And basically, distribution of results is really very much in line with the Eurobarometer, which is that about 49% of Europeans believe their voice is heard, but in Spain, only 39% of Spaniards believe that their voice is being listened to. So the results here, 53%, indicates a greater sensitivity on the part of the people in the Canary Islands towards the European issues. And this highlights 2 aspects. First of all, the Canary Islands government is very active in defending the interests of this region in Brussels. Remember that the Canary Islands set up the second office as to represent the Canary Islands in Brussels. The first was the Basque Country. And then the second aspect is that people here in the Canaries are very active, and public opinion seems to be closer. The public sees that their politicians and representatives are very active at European level, so they obviously seem to be more in tune. We've also been very aware for a number of years that European citizens feel that they're far away from Brussels and Parliament, and that is why President Juncker sent us all us commissioners, to go out on the street to be in touch with national parliaments, and that is why we've held 893 meetings with national parliaments in member states and more than 1,400 citizen dialogues like the event today, which certainly allow us to better explain European policies and to listen to the concerns of European citizens. And when I go back to Brussels, I will be explaining to my colleagues the results of these dialogues in the Canary Islands, because they differ greatly from the results that we've seen in many cities around Europe. And this really echoes a lot. It says a lot about the European sentiment that is felt here in the Canary Islands. The President. Yes, we held this dialogue yesterday on the neighbouring island of Gran Canaria, and the results was 51 to 49, more or less equal to the results this morning, more or less the same results. And I quite agree. The Canary Islands has always looked to institutions of the EU when carrying out their own policies. As the Commissioner said, we were the second region in Spain to set up an office in Brussels. We have permanent staff there, a permanent representative, and this office is actually the office that coordinates all the outermost regions. And perhaps the common agricultural policy, what we've been able to do with banana production and our special fiscal regime here, has also meant that the public here in the Canaries are more aware. And something I mentioned yesterday, people in the Canary Islands are ranking first in terms of Spaniards that join the Erasmus more young people from the Canaries who join those two programs, and that here, and people here take Europe very seriously. The Commissioner, I was an MEP since 19. I remember my good friend had debates in the European Parliament, and that was my first contact with lobbyists, and also great number of them here in the room. So I'd like to, you won't have 2 options here, but 4 options for your answer. So pull out your
It would appear that we're not that worried about Brexit, at least not the people in the room, but apparently we are very concerned about climate change, which is actually one of the topics of today's dialogue. So we're seeing now votes coming in for immigration and the economic situation as well, but it would appear that in this case climate change has the day.
¿Qué le parece, Comisario?
So what do you think of these results, Commissioner? The Commissioner. Well, I think that this survey really reflects the concerns that all European citizens share. We've seen youth movements throughout the cities of Europe in recent weeks, and really what they're doing is expressing the young people's concern about their future. That the impact that we're having on our planet, our environment, and our ecosystems. And we're seeing, obviously, also extreme weather events taking place, flooding, droughts, affecting the entire continent. And, of course, climate change is also linked to the whole question of immigration, we have to remember, because as climate change worsens in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that the populations move. So I do think it's a good thing that people are setting climate change at the top of their list of priorities. But we have to remember that climate change is also a very generic term, because stopping global warming will require an energy transition. We need to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. And this is a transition that all countries need to adopt. And this is much more difficult for island territories. So we need to be aware that this is a transition that will be fair. We need to ensure that nobody is left behind, and we need to ensure that this change in the energy model takes into account the capacity of different territories to make such a radical change to how they produce their energy, how they engage, how they build their transport systems, and how they preserve their ecosystems. I must say I'm a bit surprised also that this is a result coming from the Canary Islands, because usually in the EU, migration tends to be at the top of this list, for obvious reasons. So it's quite interesting to see that here, also Brexit, is not a major concern for the Canary Islanders, even though it's going to have repercussions for all of us. It's obviously going to have an impact on the UK, but it will certainly have an impact across the EU. You know, yesterday there was an agreement taken at the European Council, a very important decision. The European Council is trying to help the British Parliament facilitate its ability to vote in favour of the withdrawal agreement by setting deadlines. It set May 22nd as the deadline for Brexit if the vote of the withdrawal agreement next week is favourable. And if the Parliament in Westminster were to vote against the withdrawal agreement, they would set a different deadline, which would be the 12th of April, which is the date on which the European election campaign starts. So we need to consider all possible scenarios. On the one hand, there may be a deal, but there also may be a no-deal scenario. Now, I think the European Union has negotiated the withdrawal agreement very well. It's taken into account all of the concerns in order to ensure an orderly departure of the UK, and now it's up to the Parliament in Westminster to take the decisions that it needs to. So basically what the European Council done is set some deadlines in order to reduce the uncertainty around the process, which of course can have negative effects. The President. Well, on the whole topic of Brexit, I don't think it will be a challenge for the coming years. I think it will be a challenge for the coming days. We have to consider that it's very hard for us to understand what's going on. The UK has decided to leave the EU, and this is going to harm everybody, primarily the UK, but of course all of the member states of the EU are going to suffer as a result. Now, the same as in the Citizens' Dialogue yesterday, we see that climate change is at the top of the list of concerns. Here on the Canary Islands, it's very important. Our environment, our energy model, which we're currently in process of transitioning. In recent years, we have managed to make some huge steps forwards in promoting renewable energies, particularly wind energy here on the islands. There's a group of businesses in the private sector which has come together in an association in order to promote projects in these areas. We also have one of the biggest wind parks here in the Canary Islands in Granadilla, here on Tenerife. And so we're really seeing that we are working towards this energy transition, a new energy model, and that's key. This, of course, has to be linked to the whole transport policy, because we know that transport is what produces the most carbon, most greenhouse gas emissions. And it's important to consider that. Now, this is something we've discussed with the Commissioner, and I'm very grateful to the Commissioner for the support that he's always shown to the Canary Islands, not just with what's been negotiated, but also on other occasions as well, where he has really helped us guide our thinking in these areas. because the policy that is being adopted at the EU is certainly going to favor action against climate change, not just in the case of energy production, but also in how we use our energy, energy efficiency, transport. And a lot of really good work has been done. The EU really is a leader in this area, although, of course, more remains to be done. Well, we will be looking a little bit closely at some of the details related to climate change shortly. But let me just open up the floor now for questions from the audience. Now, you did have these cards that were on your seats when you came in, and you could use those to send in your questions to me. So I'll be asking the first question that I've got here. And it's this. Is it true that Europe has failed in its management of the migration crisis? Who would like to take that question? Is it true that Europe has failed in its management of the migration crisis? The Commissioner. My answer would be no. When you consider a migratory phenomenon, which has been huge, the war in Syria, of course, caused a wave of migration. In many cases, because of the war, people were seeking political asylum, but also there were economic migrants caused by a drought which took place prior to the outbreak of the conflict. In 2015, the EU took in some 1.5 million migrants, some requesting political assignments, other as economic migrants. Those are the ones that reached our borders. But if you include those in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Lebanon, we could be talking about 3.5 million in Turkey and 1.5 million in Lebanon and Jordan. So we're talking about vast masses of people moving as a result of this. 1.5 million that reached the EU, but millions more in the neighborhood of the EU. And this is, of course, hard to manage. Our external borders did manage to withstand the pressure. In the EU, we took in 1.5 million people. All of them were dealt with appropriately. We were able to manage their requests for asylum. Some were returned to their countries, and others received asylum, depending on their status. I think also we need to consider that a European policy was put into place in order to respond to this. Now, Spain did have bilateral agreements with some of these countries for returning migrants. But these agreements were then further strengthened and beefed up and brought across the EU as a result of all of this. So what we've seen is a lot of solidarity across the EU with the countries that have our external coasts. And we've helped financially the countries that have taken in more migrants in order to help ensure that humanitarian conditions were being respected in the camps and so on. So this is everything that we've been done. Of course, we do need to continue in our migration policy. We need to ensure that when it comes to dealing with migration, fighting against terrorism, our citizens are asking for help with this. These are things that they want. And so we do need to strengthen our borders. This is why we've had this new Frontier and Border Protection Service, which has also been further strengthened, which is going to help with the national border guards, which are already doing this work. There's also the Maritime Rescue Service. So we talk about those reaching our coast, but since 2015, we've actually saved the lives of more than 730,000 people as they were crossing the waters towards the EU. So we do need to harmonize asylum and migration policy, applying uniform standards across the EU. We need to continue to invest in Africa with the Plan Africa, which is already in place, which will help countries and which will also ensure readmissions in certain countries. And we also need to try and further promote legal migration to the EU, set a framework for legal migration that will help the member states that need the migrants. So the EU will help to coordinate these policies, which of course will be set at a national level, aware of the needs and the demand for a workforce in our member states. Now, of course, our union is a union based on values. In Citizen Dialogues, I always like to cite Article 2 of the treaty. It says that the union is based on the values of respect, human dignity, liberty, democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including those of minorities, and that all of these values are common and shared by all member states based on a society built on pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality. These are the underlying principles, the foundation of the European Union. And of course, all of this can help us ensure integration with migration. And it's all been further buttressed by rulings of the European Court of Justice, which sets out the conditions under which this type of integration needs to take place. So the policy has not been a failure, but this policy does continue to evolve. There's a dialogue with the Council and the Parliament to see how we can further develop common migration policies. In any case, my message is clear. Given the situation that we're currently in, national responses cannot solve the problem on their own. We need to have European solidarity. In times where we see that the impact is greater in some member states than in others, the EU can help. We're talking about Italy, Spain, there's also Turkey, a neighboring country, Morocco as well, which receives support, to ensure that we have a European response to this major problem. And this is a problem that might actually increase in importance if we do not tackle climate change properly, because we'll continue to see suffering increase in Africa.
How will Brexit affect the Canary Islands, and what is being done to avoid any negative impact? The President, we were the first region here to set up a follow-up committee coordinated by Pedro Ortega, Regional Minister for Economy. Essentially, there are three aspects to this. Firstly, devaluation of the pound sterling, because we have more than 5 million UK tourists visiting every year. So the Canary Islands might be less competitive versus other destinations in Europe and Spain. The second aspect has a lot to do with the common agricultural policy and subsidies to transport. If compensation are given for cucumbers, tomatoes and other exports to the UK, these will be very negatively impacted. We're trying to set up some sort of dialogue with the EU to create an avenue there, given that we are an outermost region, to see if there's any chance for us to keep receiving those compensations. Otherwise, we'll have to look at other formulae. And then third aspect, mobility, air traffic. We have a number of companies that might stop connecting the Canary Islands with the rest of the world. And of course, this has an impact, a great impact, because tourists arrive here mainly by air. So we're working on all of that. There are some aspects that don't only hinge on us, but other member states or the Spanish government. We've been asking the Spanish government to come in and help us. So first of all, we need to ensure that there is common sense and that the deadlines given yesterday by Council will be accepted so that there won't be an abrupt Brexit or a hard Brexit or no-deal Brexit. So let's see if all of this will lead us to recover and regain our common sense. Next question. The EU Plan Africa, what might this mean for the Canary Islands? The Commissioner. Firstly, Plan Africa promotes investments in countries from where migrants come to Europe. So if we could foster economic growth in Africa so that young people can actually stay in their countries of origin, that would lessen the pressure of migration flows. Investments of Europe in Africa offer opportunities to all businesses and companies in Europe to take part in that process, which means greater development of Africa. So the first impact is certainly to lessen the intensity of migratory flows, and secondly, to create opportunities for investment and therefore help Africa to develop and grow economically. Now, remember that Africa is going to have a huge demographic explosion, even more so than India. And secondly, there are 800 million people in Africa at the moment who have no access to energy, to the grid. That means that they don't have access to mobile phones or to internet. Therefore, they can't really establish industry or create job opportunities. There are huge opportunities for electric energy and setting up grids in the African continent. This can be done sustainably in a modern fashion and using renewable energies, or it can be done using fossil fuels. So if we have to ensure that we reduce climate change. So one of the main challenges in the African continent and also for Europe is this precisely. And that is why Plan Africa, which is an alternative to the Juncker plan, this might mobilize 44 billion euros. And this certainly will foster economic growth in Africa. But we can't fool ourselves. For a developing country or continent to ensure sustainable economic growth, the first thing that's required is legal, stable frameworks that will favor foreign investment, because to provide energy in any country requires modern energy system, to modernize them, and this requires the private sector to come in. We can't cover all needs with public funds. So member states and of the EU have set up funds in their budgets and subsidies to these countries. We're talking about 20,000 billion euros, but that's just a drop in the ocean. And the private sector will certainly be keen to invest in the African continent, provided that we can set up stable legal frameworks that will give investors legal certainty. And that's the great difference. You can see two countries, neighboring countries in Africa, one with a legal framework that receives foreign investment, and the neighboring country, they don't have a legal framework that's stable, and therefore they don't receive investment. This has been studied and demonstrated. So we need to have diplomatic action to improve national legal structures in African countries that wish to further develop with important investments from private companies in Europe. President, would you like to add anything further? No? Well, we'll move on to our next part. We had seen that the question earlier, 50% of you in this room expressed your concern about climate change. So we're going to have a debate, part of this dialogue we're going to devote it to climate change and energy transition here in the Canary Islands. But before we pose these questions, Commissioner, what is the European Commission doing to combat climate change and to promote the use of clean energies? Well, I think we've done everything at EU level, and I'm not being modest here. The EU was absolutely instrumental in the Paris Accord signed in 2015. Climate negotiations have normally taken part on a bipartisan level, like between the US and China, and once they reach a fundamental agreement, everybody else would come on board and subscribe the agreement. But in Paris, we, the EU, we launched strategic alliances with all the countries of Pacific Islands and the African, Caribbean and Pacific region, Latin American countries. And with the help of Marshall Islands, I actually went and visited the Pacific and spoke to all the island nation states, and we launched something that we called the High Ambition Coalition, over 120 countries that really wanted an ambitious Paris Accord. And that's what we agreed. We agreed to stop climate change well below 2 degrees centigrade, below pre-industrial revolution levels. And the first thing we did was to set up a very ambitious agreement. And secondly, in the Paris Accord, every party would put on the table their commitment to reducing CO2 emissions, and the EU put on the table the most ambitious plan to reduce CO2 emissions. Our commitment to reduce at least 20% of emissions by 2030 in comparison with 1990. And then secondly, we also launched a very powerful legal framework to comply with those commitments. We've modified the markets of CO2 emission rights. It was at €5 before, now it's at over 25 euros. We've also established binding targets for all member states in the farming, transport, waste management sectors. We've also regulated the use of land and forestry. We've changed the entire use of energy, renewables, use of renewable energies in buildings. So we've established a stable legal framework, as I was saying before, for Africa, and we've set up that stable legal framework for ourselves. And it's great because next year, or rather this year, 2019, there are going to be 10 national elections in Europe. So 10 governments at least are going to change. And then we've got the European Parliament. So we're going to have, whatever happens, we might have populists or far right or far left, but the 27 countries are going to have to implement these policies. And it's very different. In the United States, if the president changes, is not re-elected, policies change. But here, the President of the Commission or Council might change, but the policies will still be implemented. And the wonderful thing about this legal framework is that the European Parliament has been exceedingly ambitious. We had designed legislation to reach a 40% reduction in CO2 emissions, and now we have even more ambitious targets for renewable energies, 32%. And this will lead us to reduce our CO2 emissions by 45%. So basically, we have the legislation, and by 2030, we'll reach that target of 45% reduction. And by 2050, if all goes well, we'll reach a target of 60% in reduction of CO2 emissions. Now, science is telling us that that is not enough, that by 2050, we should be carbon neutral, that is 0% CO2 emissions, and by 2060 or 2080, we should reach climate neutrality. So 0% of greenhouse gases. Now, to do that, we've set up a policy of decarbonization to see how we can reach that 100% target for reduction of greenhouse gases by 2050. So we have an ambitious goal, we have legislation that promotes that, and strategic vision to know where we have to be by 2050. You can't do politics if you don't know where you want to get to. You can't do politics thinking about the next local, regional, national, or European elections. You have to do politics for the long term, as young people are asking us to do. So in Europe, we've done as much as we can and could, but we're only responsible for 9% of global emissions. So in addition to us doing our homework and pulling our weight, other countries have to do the same. And the greatest risks are, the greatest emitters are China. They're already setting up legislation, and they are the largest investor at the moment in renewable energies around the world. Per capita, the EU is far ahead in terms of renewable energies, but certainly China is making the largest investments. And we have to meet the challenge of hydrogen use in transport. And China there is leading the pack. They're producing batteries, lithium batteries, and electric cars. So China is actually moving forward. India is a problem, and Africa is a question mark. In India, at the moment, emission data, they're not very good at all, because they're still using a large amount of fossil fuels, and they're not developing renewable energies as ambitiously as China, but rather using nuclear. And Africa is a question mark. It might go in one direction, a good direction, or down the wrong avenue. So now the fact is that if we all work together, we will be able to stop global warming. If we fail at that task, we will see terrible, very remarkable impacts in the next few years. And if we see the current increase every decade of temperatures worldwide, well, we'll be looking at a very complex scenario in the future, desertification in Mediterranean areas, polar caps melting, therefore sea levels rising, problems for coastal regions, enormous impacts that we really have to avoid, and we have to work hard. And that's why these policies are so difficult. They're long-term policies. They require the agreement of the 28 or 27 members of the EU, but also countries, but also the 190-odd countries in the agreement for climate change.
Yes, actually, we will be continuing our discussion of that, because there are a number of questions now that are being asked, and we are going to try and answer all of them, because, of course, you want to know the answers. And the first one I'll ask you has to do precisely with that strategy you're talking about, the 2050 strategy and the decarbonization of the economy. The question is, within this 2050 strategy of having a carbon-neutral economy and society, how do you think this will affect the Canary Islands as an outermost region? The President. Well, I think in terms of outermost regions, we really are in the best position and the best size in order to be able to implement pilot projects in implementation. We've already started this with the island of El Hierro and the use of wind energy there. I think it really serves as an example of how it can be done. For years now, they've been using renewables on that island. And it's also showing, of course, there's still work that needs to be done in how to store the energy once it's been generated, because you need to be able to store it as well as generate it. In order to ensure the growth of the economy, you need to ensure constant energy production, not when the wind stops or the sun goes down, you have to turn your machines off. It needs to be constant. And I think as an outermost region, we've always been active. There have been meetings that have been held with our parliaments and with the commissions, and we really see ourselves as being an opportunity for experiments. In the past 3 years in the Canary Islands, I think we've really removed many of the barriers to implementing renewables here on the islands through, for instance, adaptations to the land use legislation, which allows changes to be made to rural lands. And also, the regulatory framework is much clearer now. It really helps developers, whether they're public or private, to be able to launch these types of very complex projects and to give them some sort of legal certainty over time. For instance, when we launched the wind park in Granadilla, we were talking about a time frame of some 15 to 18 years. Of course, you can't sit around and wait that long these days. As the commissioner has already said, we're seeing that climate change is happening faster than expected. We're talking about the rate at which it's happening year on year, and so we need to take action now. We're talking about the devastating effects they could have on life across our planet. So, of course, it's not a challenge for the Canary Islands. It's not even just a challenge just for Europe. It's a challenge for the whole world. And if we have a hard time coming to an agreement here on the islands, you can just imagine how we're going to imagine it with all of our member states. The Commissioner. Well, so of course, when it comes to decarbonizing the economy and this strategy, all sectors need to be on board, not just the energy industry. It needs to be everybody involved. Right now, we're seeing that fossil fuels use is about 95% of GDP globally. And we need to move towards a situation where wind power is producing some, or whether energy is produced to the tune of some 80 and 85% using renewables. And looking at island situations, well, of course, they face different and more difficulties, because when it comes to storing energy, they have a harder time doing that than they might in other territories. And also when it comes to connecting with neighboring countries, say, for instance, that might be producing in excess of nuclear energy, they don't have access to those sorts of connections. Now, in Spain, for instance, we can export renewable energy to France, but then when France then has an excess or surplus of its nuclear power, then it can then export it back to us. So that you have these sorts of connections that allow us to maintain a balance. In islands, things are much more complex. Now, I'm very grateful to the President of the Government of the Canary Islands for the collaboration that he's shown us. We have work that we're doing in order to ensure clean energies. There was a forum held in Lanzarote last year where we launched a number of pilot projects to promote clean energies across 5 islands, and one is the island of La Palma, where we're going to be running pilot projects looking at how we can promote the energy transition in the islands. Again, within this framework of clean energy for islands, which was launched actually in Greece a few years back. We're very aware of the challenges faced by islands, of the complex situation they face when it comes to energy production, and so we need to find solutions that are different for them. At the same time, we have to see that the Canary Islands really are quite ideal when it comes to renewables. When you think of photovoltaic or wind energies, they really are in the perfect conditions in order to promote the use of renewables, as long as we can solve the big problem of storage. And that is something that we're going to be working on. There are research projects ongoing across the EU, a lot of funding being poured into that. Hopefully, in the next few years, we'll be seeing more innovation coming out in that area of energy storage. Right now, we're in a situation where energy storage systems do not offer us the coefficients and the efficiency that we need, but I think technology really will take a step forward and allow us to solve those storage problems in the not-too-distant future, and also at a reasonable cost. We're seeing that the cost of renewables has really dropped in photovoltaic and solar power, and we're now seeing it in wind power, in tidal energy as well. And so I think the cost of energy storage will follow suit. We'll see increasing power storage, and we'll also be seeing lower costs. And this, of course, will benefit the islands. But in any case, the energy transition has to be something that ensures also social justice, where no region is left behind. It's not a matter where France and Spain have got 100% renewables, and then you've got other regions where it's only at 5%. You need to be in a situation where everybody can move towards cleaner and cheaper sources of energy production. You need cheap energy for tourism and for industry here on the islands. The moderator, another question. How is the EU going to deal with Poland's insistence to continue to use coal for its energy production? The Commissioner. Well, with the case to Poland, let me say this. In the regulation of the electricity market, the EU has set out a regulation that says that state aid cannot be provided to power stations that produce more than 450 units of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So if you have a coal-fired power station, for instance, which is highly polluting, it needs to be working at the market prices without aid. So there's two problems here. On the one hand, you're emitting CO2 to the atmosphere, so you can't benefit from state aid. Secondly, if you're emitting CO2, you need to buy then on the auction market the rights to emit this CO2. And Poland has been complaining about the price on the market, saying that it's too high. And then the other problem is that you need to move towards renewables because renewables are starting to become cheaper than coal. So citizens want cheap energy. And if you see that there's a capacity to produce energy cheaply or more cheaply with renewables, it's easier to decarbonize the economy and move away from coal. But at the same time, we have to remember we have to talk about a fair transition, a transition that is based on coal-fired power plants and fossil fuels towards something that's more renewable, more advanced, also moving towards electric vehicles, battery-powered vehicles. And that's something that we're trying to move towards in Poland. We're seeing the latest generation of batteries are being installed in Poland. There's also an electric bus factory which is going to be built in Poland, and a lot is going to be done in order to try and transform the transport sector there. Of course, it's going to be a gradual change, but it's clear that coal is very important in Poland. And the solidarity movement here with the tradition of communism is all based on the shipyards and the coal mines. And so, of course, coal is very important, and the lobby has a very strong voice in the Polish government. But that doesn't mean you can turn your back to the future of renewables. We're talking about an energy transition. We're talking about a time frame up to 2050. And we know that this is a transition that's going to happen sooner or later. And so you really need to put all of the necessary financial resources on the table in order to finance this conversion, to help the workers and move the economy more in the direction of the future technologies. It's been said many times, it needs to be done. Poland is a country that most use coal, but it's not the only one, I should say. There's a lot of other EU member states that use it as well. So a lot of talk about Poland, but there are other countries as well that have plans to abandon the use of coal over time. The moderator, another question. Do you think Spain will reach the 2020 renewable energies targets? And perhaps as a moderator, I can ask a question for the Canary Islands. The President. Well, in the past few years, we're in a position where we can reach that by 2025. 45% is the target that's been set, if I'm not mistaken, for renewable energy use. We've moved from just under 8% to almost 20%. And if everything goes well, we will exceed 20% this year in 2019 in the latest call that's going out. And I think we are on track to meet all of these objectives by 2025. We will reach the 45% target. Now, the Commission has already made this point that this is a global challenge, not just a challenge for the Canary Islands. But I think if we do our bit, if we do our homework, we will be in a position to meet that goal. The Commissioner. Right now, Spain and the European Commission as a whole is at about 17% overall with a target of 20% in sight. So Europe is on its way to meeting that 20% target. It's not inconceivable that it will be reached. 32% will be a bit harder because we'll need to step up our developments in order to reach that. It's a bit more ambitious. And in 2023, it's expected that there will be a revision, actually, of the objective for 2030, depending on the developments in the costs of renewable energies. So it's quite possible that for 2030, we actually have even higher targets than we do now. But it will be the next commissioner who will decide that. I'm happy now with the 32% that have been set, and we'll have to see what the next commissioner decides. In any case, from 17.5%, we will reach those targets. But the problem is that overall we're at 17.5%. But within the member state level, there are many member states that will not meet their targets. France, the Netherlands, for instance, Luxembourg. They're far from meeting their national targets. In the case of Spain, we're on track. But in other member states, some very important member states of the EU, they're not going to meet their targets. Now, if a country does not meet its target because it has internal difficulties with project development or because of the issue of the environment or lack of private initiative, there is a mechanism in place for regional cooperation. So you can invest in another country where it's perhaps easier to invest, and then you can include that in the developments for your country. But it's actually very hard for a member state to invest public funds in development of renewables across the border in order to meet their own national targets. But that is a mechanism that has been provided for. In the court in Luxembourg, there's actually considerable fines that could be given should targets not be met. So you have the choice, either pay the fine or agree to invest abroad. The moderator. Well, we have got another question, actually quite a few more questions, although we are running out of time, would be what about the meeting of all of the European and global climate targets?
Climate action is very important, and most of the work is done in urban areas and large European cities. So cities really are the main stakeholders here. And this has a lot to do with the energy and climate plans that member states have to put on the table. Spain presented its own 2 months late. And those plans have to be displayed to the public so that they can have a view. And I think that autonomous regions in Spain and cities, through their mayors, will have to explain what role they want to play in reaching the national targets, because this national plan can't simply outline a number, but also how are you going to reach that target, what means are going to be needed, etc. So it's the comprehensive plan, national plan for climate action, and it brings together all the various actors to combat climate change, which is not only public institutions but citizens in general. Energy transition requires a change of behavior on the part of citizens on how they use energy, how they produce it themselves, how they store it, how they can take part in the grid and reach that balance. So energy transition is not just simply developing and rolling out renewable energy facilities, but it also depends on individual decisions, which kind of freezer or electrical appliances will you buy? Are they energy efficient or not? And we also have rules that will be introduced into design of electrical appliances so that consumers in Europe can purchase these when they're more efficient, use energy more efficiently with no programmed obsolescence. So remember, it's not only public administrations and institutions, but also the decisions taken by citizens are very, very important in terms of reducing energy consumption. Next question, what measures is the EU implementing to reduce or to promote energy transition in the Canary Islands? The Commissioner. We have a number of instruments. We have 3 very powerful ones. Firstly, structural funds, EU structural funds, which are available to all autonomous regions, and about 25% of the structural funds has to be applied to interventions that will for climate change. So that's a prerequisite. Secondly, we have what's called the Juncker plan, 260 million euros in investments in many sectors, including renewable energy and energy efficiency. And for the next period, this will be doubled and will reach about 650 million euros in investments. And then, thirdly, we have the Horizon 2020 program for R&D, research and development. That will fund a great number of projects. Research projects, and I also have the innovation program with 11 billion euros to foster innovation in energy storage, renewable energy. So we have a number of tools available. Some have a regional distribution, like the structural funds, but other programs like the Juncker plan can be accessed by anyone, depending on the quality of the projects, or the Innovation Fund, which is quite innovative. We'll have a call of proposals soon in this year, 2019. So there will be instruments available, but then one has to create less red tape. We have to simplify through new directives to use one-stop shops, simplified procedures to evaluate and assess environmental impact, and to therefore make it easier. Then fostering development, funding it, and then we'll need regulations, a stable legal framework to allow us and the actors to have their forecasts without creating legal uncertainty. So we've done all of that. We've improved our legal framework to ensure stability so that those who wish to invest and develop renewable facilities can see what will happen in the long term in terms of investment. So we've learned quite a lot about our mistakes of the past to reach a very ambitious plan so that we can develop renewable energy in the future. And I'm sure we can achieve that. But sometimes more important than investments is to simplify red tape so that these projects can be implemented sometimes. I'm not talking about the Canary Islands here, but rather the EU28, which you might have one project or promoter in Bulgaria or Hungary or Italy. Every country, every member state is like a different world, but we do need a common shared framework to simplify procedures. The President, and I would like to add a plan for outermost regions. We were discussing this with the Juncker plan. We couldn't really access the funding because the European Bank was evaluating projects with huge investments which were unfeasible for the Canary Islands. So every time we've had the opportunity to talk to the Commissioner, he's showed his sensitivity towards smaller investment projects for outermost regions. This is in fact a loan with the very low interest rates. Here in the Canary Islands, it's very difficult to set up a large-scale project of like 80, 90 million euros. Yes, in the Juncker plan, says the Commissioner, we pay special attention to outermost regions. We're not talking about oil pipes that require millions and millions of euros, but certainly the projects are smaller and require our backing. Next question, energy transition. How do you choose a project? The Commissioner. The European Union and the Commission totally respects decisions taken at national level for their energy mix. The EU Treaty establishes that the energy mix is something to be established and determined by the member state. Of course, they have to comply with the targets of emissions reductions and renewables, but certainly we have technology neutrality. What the European Commission does is to try to support innovation and development so that all technologies can be cost-effective and to reduce energy production costs in the EU. But if a country decides to use hydrogen or electrification, then the Commission will be fine as long as these are clean energies. Of course, if we want to produce electric cars or low-emission cars, you can use electric cars or batteries which have to be charged with renewable energies or lithium batteries. Of course, you can't design electric cars which then need to have batteries recharged with fuel fossils. That wouldn't make sense. And it would be quite ridiculous. So we are technology neutral. We support the development of clean energy and the most competitive and efficient forms of energy. And I think that's the best way forward. And it's the people in business, the private sector, who have to decide whether they want to invest in offshore wind or wind energy or others. That's, we believe, the most sensible way forward. Yeah, the President. Yes, indeed. We're now in this period of transition, and I don't think it's worthwhile to have a debate whether, like here in the Canaries, whether we want to have gas, yes or no. I believe we don't want to be using gas, but until we have the right technology to be able to promote photovoltaic or wind energy further, we have to keep going, moving forward, using a certain amount of fossil fuels or less polluting energies. We're working on geothermal energy, also looking into hydrogen, of course, especially for vehicles. We've launched a pilot project. We're applying tax breaks for the purchase of hybrid or low-emission or electric vehicles. But while we're on this path, we have to look at all the energies that produce fewer CO2 emissions. In the case of gas, I don't know, Commissioner, but I think that the vessels, what was the deadline for use of gas in vessels, in ships? I think it's as from 2022 or 2025. And we need the Canary Islands ports here to be able to supply gas to those vessels so that they can be much more efficient in terms of the use of fuel.
Christian David González Quintero asked about wind farms and solar farms and whether they would affect tourism as a result of the environmental impact. The President. Well, I don't think so. I think actually it's increasingly seen as a tourist strategy. Tourists want to look for tourist destinations that are also sustainable. So they will choose their package on the basis of how sustainable the destination is, whether the hotel infrastructure uses renewable energies, whether what you're eating is mile zero food. I think there's actually opportunities opening up here, particularly when it comes to German tourists. This is what they're looking for increasingly. They want to be able to contribute to the fight against climate change, also on their holidays, supporting the companies that are maybe a bit more environmentally friendly. Right now, the wind parks that are in place and those that are in planning, of course, have to be in places where there's wind. I think that goes without saying. But for us at least, we think that this is an element that citizens are aware of. They want to protect their environment. They want to help planet Earth, hopefully improve our lives on the planet. And they're perfectly aware that if they want to have a source of energy, then they're going to need to accept wind turbines. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with fossil fuels, and we'll have a beautiful landscape, but climate change will probably end up leading to desertification, destroying the landscape anyhow. The Commissioner made that point. So at the end of the day, we won't have any landscapes left to protect because we will have destroyed our planet. José Manuel Valles Viejo asked a question about whether public funds are being used in the EU to promote this. Private funds are being used in the USA. Are we sufficiently flexible and competitive? The Commissioner, what's being done with the private initiatives in the United States is what they're doing. Just take electric cars, for instance. Tesla, perfect example. Without state aid and subsidies from the US government, Tesla would not be where it is. The US supports private industry, the aeronautics industry as well. What's the impact as well about military spending, which is also public spending? All of the technological advances, also with public money. In the EU, we have got regional policy that permits grants, which tries to strike a balance with per capita income between different regions. So these aren't set amounts. What we do is set the structural funds in order to try and ensure harmonious and sustainable development of all the regions of Europe. So when we design research programs, for instance, well, the U.S. has also got its own research agencies, just as we do. We've got Horizon 2020, which is open up to university, and the United States has also got all of its research institutes, which are supported with public funds. So everyone uses public money in order to support innovation. All public budgets support defense spending, for instance. Right now, there's a lot of controversy about whether there should be an increase in defense spending or not. The U.S. saying that the Europeans should be paying their way more. And all defense investment is investment from public funds that spurs technological innovation in that area. And we're all, of course, doing a lot of work there, too. Now, pure subsidies, the ones that we want to do away with, are the ones that are simply just support fossil fuels. Those are the ones we need to do away with. If you look at the bill for fossil fuels, it's some 266 billion euros in imports of fossil fuels across the EU annually. Now, if we can get rid of that, we can save 80% of that bill, and we can spend it on other things. 55 billion euros are spent by member states to fossil fuel subsidies. Those are the subsidies we need to eliminate. One final question from the moderator. Does it make sense that the member states should be able to buy emissions rights, or is that something should be left to the private sector? The Commissioner. The EU arranges to meet its emissions targets without purchasing emissions rights from other from other third countries. We try and do it through our own domestic or internal policies. But there are other countries that can't do that. They don't have the capacity that we have to do it on their own. So then what we do is generate this system or these mechanisms, an emissions rights market. Say, for example, you've got Brazil. Meeting its forestry objectives of 3 million hectares, and all of the carbon sequestration that takes place as a result of the planting of these forests then has a market value. And countries can then buy those rights in order to meet their own emissions targets. So they're not making the efforts, but they're purchasing, if you like, the extra effort that's been made by another country. In the Paris Agreement, in Article 6, it sets down the rules for the issuing of these emissions rights. That needs to be an additional effort in order to globally reduce emissions. And if this is done, then we will be able to reduce the emissions overall. Now, within the EU, what we have is a system of emissions rights that are assigned to the various power plants or factories, what they're allowed to emit. And if they exceed the rights that they've been given, then they need to then pay and purchase those rights from others on the market. So this means that if you have to pay a lot for these rights, then what you'll do is prefer to invest in reducing your own emissions, because it's cheaper to invest in reducing your emissions than to pay for the right to emit more, or at will. So there are two different mechanisms, really. In aviation as well, there's an example. It's the transport sector, which is where emissions are growing the most. Airplanes are using traditional fossil fuels. So in order to compensate for all of the emissions that they're producing, a mechanism called CORSIA has been developed. This is in order to counteract the emissions produced by the aviation industry, and this is all done through these clean rights mechanisms. It's all very complex, this whole world of emissions, but basically what we're driving at is that overall, globally, we want to be able to reduce the overall amount of greenhouse gases emitted. It can be done through for instance, purchasing the rights from other countries and then meeting our own targets in that way. As long as we're moving towards a zero carbon economy, then we're on the right track. The President, well, it's a mechanism which is agreed between the 197 countries. If you don't have good mechanisms in place in order to meet your targets, then nobody's going to even make the effort to meet them, and you'll fall short of them. Of course, everybody should be meeting their climate targets. Not everybody, however, is in the position to do that right now. So we've created this mechanism which will facilitate this compensation. The same thing happens with us with the deficit and all the rules that we have on our expenditure. The moderator. Well, perhaps we could leave this whole section on climate change and energy transition and move on to another topic. We have got a little bit more time left, so I'd ask you to take out your mobile phones again. We're going to ask another question. It's time for you to get active again. Of course, you've been participating all morning, but we'll have another question for you. We're going to ask you just to answer with one word. It's not a list of options, so I want you to answer the following question. In May, there will be European elections. What do these elections mean to you? Please define them with just one word. So in May, there will be European elections. What do these elections mean to you? Please just give one word as your answer. The ones that are repeated the most are the ones that will show up a bit bigger on the screen. So right now what we're seeing are the words future and hope.
Futuro, cambio, oportunidad, esperanza.
Future, change, opportunity, and hope.
Por ahí, unión, coherencia.
Union, consistency, identity, progress.
No sé si las quieren ir comentando.
Well, I can see the words are changing, but it would appear that the ones that's getting the most votes are change, opportunity, followed by future, and hope, followed by progress, responsibility. Well, I guess it makes sense. Well, at least they're all positive words. Well, we also see other words, challenge, very little. But it would appear that overall, at least, it would appear to be that people are hopeful. They see it as a chance for change. What do you think? What really is at stake in the upcoming European elections?
The three words defined the current situation. At the moment, we are trying to face Brexit. For the first time, a member state is leaving the EU, and this is tremendously complex from the political point of view. We'd never addressed a situation like this before. We've had a lot of people knocking on our door to join the EU, but it's the first time a member state is leaving. And this gives the 27 member states remaining the opportunity to delve deeper into European construction. So on the 27th of May, we'll have a special extraordinary council meeting to think about the future of the EU, the changes that we have to implement in our policies, how fast we have to do that as well. And I believe that the European elections are a perfect moment for all candidates, the leaders of the various political groups represented in the political debate. Well, it's an ideal opportunity for them to put on the table their ideas for the future. We have to reinforce the EU. We need more Europe in everything. We need more shared migratory policy. We need more development of the euro policy, more social policies. We need more ambition in terms of combating climate change. The next Commission and European Parliament will have to look at their targets for decarbonisation. Will they go for the more ambitious ones, like I would like and the Commission would like, or the more conservative targets, like other member states want? So the next mandate is going to be extremely intense. There's going to be a lot of new policies, and it's going to be very important to stick together to maintain unity, because one of the consequences of Brexit is that the 27 member states have been very, very united. And in terms of Brexit, we think of the word future. So these parliamentary elections in the EU are going to attract a lot of attention, because 367 million European citizens are going to be voting. 22 million people are going to be voting for the first time in this current political atmosphere, where we have to face a lot of issues and problems. We have to continue with social and economic recovery, reducing the inequality gaps produced by the financial crisis. So we have tremendous challenges ahead. We have to combat international terrorism, protect citizens, guarantee their safety and security. We have to be global leaders as well, try to compete with China and the US, Japan or Korea on an equal or level playing field. So I think all of the terms that came up on the screen were very interesting. Problems, yes, that word came up, but I would say no, not problems, solutions. The President. In the case of the Canary Islands, I think there is a lot at stake. We're looking at a new programming period for the budget as an outermost region, and in terms of common agricultural policy, we'll have to. The Commission was talking about 3.9%, but yesterday the Commissioner gave us a great piece of news, and he said that if France, Portugal, and Spain stand together to avoid reducing subsidies to their outermost regions, and if we still stand together, as I say, that reduction of 3.7% in the budgets might be reviewed and taken on board favourably by the EU. But we, the Canary Islands, are really, we have our future on the line. There are lots of political parties that are Eurosceptic around Europe. They don't share the vision of the EU. They don't share the spirit of Article 2 that the Commission mentioned earlier this morning. And against all of these trends, citizens can't really turn a blind eye. Those of us leading the institutions, we have to do our job. But when it comes to exercising your right to vote, citizens will have to think about what they want for their future in Europe. We defend a strong Europe for the future with great degrees of solidarity, which we have to think about the values of unity, solidarity, so that we can look towards the future with optimism. But at the end of the day, it's citizens who have a voice. So I'd like to urge people to take part in those European elections, not thinking about that particular moment, that whether they're upset or displeased with the EU. It's very important that they vote thinking about the future. What type of the Canary Islands, what type of Spain and Europe do you want for the future? So citizens have to, the moderator, citizens have to feel that they're part of the project of building Europe. So we're wrapping up now. We've run out of time. And before we do come to a close, do you have any final remarks? These citizens' dialogues have been extremely interesting with a lot of participation. So I'd like to ask the President of the Canary Islands government to give us a take-home message from what we've heard this morning. The President. Well, my conclusion is that, as opposed to perhaps other citizen dialogues, we've seen a great amount of awareness, citizen awareness here in the Canaries in terms of what Europe is, what the institutions are. We see the polling data here, 50-50, people do feel that their voice is heard from the Canaries. But we must remember that 80% of the rules and regulations and laws that affect us in our daily lives emanate from the EU. Sometimes they might seem that they're very far away, but there is legislation, agreements are made, and 80% of our rules and regulations and laws that govern our daily life come from the European Parliament, emanate from the European Parliament. So I'd like to congratulate the Commissioner for this initiative, for coming to the Canary Islands. I really would like to thank him for his work over the last 3.5 years when we've needed his guidance, collaboration, to face the challenges that we have here in the Canary Islands as an outermost region. The Commissioner has always helped us very much. Along with his staff, we've felt listened to and supported by the Commissioner and his office. So I hope these citizen dialogues will continue. And I hope that citizens will be more keen to understand and raise their awareness about EU. So we have to also start with education, to start working with younger kids, boys and girls, so that they are more aware of what the EU does in their initiatives. Commissioner, how would you conclude? Well, I've been favourably impressed and surprised. Every time I come to the Canary Islands, I always have a great time. I've learnt a lot on every visit, and I've done my best to help the government here and the institutions. But today I really am very surprised, because we've held so many of these citizen dialogues. Sometimes they're very, very tough, and there are aggressions towards the EU institutions. But here in the Canary Islands, you see that there is a feel for Europe. People live and understand and are aware of EU issues. And people here also understand that the problems of the Canary Islands are debated in Brussels and Europe. They know that the topics and issues that affect the Canary Islanders are very much in the European Parliament and Commissions and the Commission. And there is also collaboration with other member states who have outermost regions, with high-level summits with the President of the Republic of France or the Prime Minister of Spain, the Prime Minister of Portugal. Now, I've, for example, used all of these policies for electric interconnections. Every time that we have a summit of this nature, things go much faster. So if you want to come and see us in Brussels, come soon and coordinate with other member states. And the second take-home message for me is that it's quite evident that the European sentiment has to be responded to from Europe with greater sensitivity, especially with member states or regions that have greater difficulty in implementing policy. When you design a policy, you have to be mindful of the fact that its implementation will require certain costs and certain requirements depending on the region. We can't have a one-size-fits-all. We need to look at the instruments and the tools that are required by every member state and region in order to implement the policy. So those are my two conclusions, my two take-home message. The very nice news to see here that the Canary Islands people are much more aware of the impacts of climate change and look favorably on the European Union, and also what we have to do from the European institutions to meet the concerns of our citizens, which are so very different and are so important for economic development. And we also have to remember that per capita GDP is much different in some regions than others. And in order to reach that convergence, we have to help them to join platforms and logistic platforms, or when you have a different type of market. Here the markets are hindered by barriers, etc. Well, that's it, says the moderator. Thank you very much to the European Commissioner for Climate Action and Energy, and our gratitude to the President of the Canary Islands government, Fernando Clavijo, for also taking part in this citizen dialogue. Thank you very much.
Les decía que a todos ustedes también, por supuesto.
I was saying thank you also to those in attendance and for your participation. Otherwise, this citizen dialogue would not have been possible, and we hope to see you back on another occasion. Thank you.